If you are interested in learning how to draw leaves, how to create more impact in your work, or if you're interested in learning more about the Lightfast colored pencils and the Lightfast paper that I use to create this drawing, then this video is definitely for you. For this particular drawing, I decided to use the Derwent Lightfast colored pencils exclusively on a piece of Derwent Lightfast paper. And I've had quite a bit of experience using the Lightfast pencils over the last year, but this is my very first experience ever using the Lightfast paper. And I can tell you right now that I just really loved it. I started my piece with a line drawing of my photo reference. And when I laid out the lines, I not only made sure that I captured the details in the flowers, but I also made sure that I mapped in the outlines, the vein structure, and the shapes of the shadows in the leaves. Of course, the passion flowers are the focal point in this piece, but it's important to note that a strong composition keeps the viewer's attention on the flowers. If the composition was awkward or if the proportions in the leaves were off, they would pull attention in a distracting way. I also took this opportunity to shift the angle and size of a couple leaves to create a more interesting composition and more dynamic negative space. After a strong line drawing was completed, I started laying in the initial color. I worked back and forth between the flowers and the leaves, never allowing the petals of the passion flower to get too far ahead of the leaves in the background. When I began applying colored pencils to the leaves, I didn't worry too much about the texture in the leaves, but I did really focus on the value of both the leaves and the negative space. As I laid in the initial color in these first few layers, I really tried to focus on using as few pencils as possible. And having just a few pencils that I was using meant that I could hold them all in my hand at the same time, and that I wasn't experiencing that decision paralysis by what color should I pick when I really didn't even have the value and color relationships marked in on my paper first. So I would definitely recommend starting with fewer pencils and then building up more pencils as you're working throughout the piece. Once I had light to medium coverage over the entire piece of paper, I started blending this initial layer with solvent. I started with a little bit of solvent on my brush and began blending out the background. And you'll notice that really quickly the colors intensify and that white speckly look starts disappearing. And this is one of the reasons that I love using solvent when I'm working on a traditional white cotton paper. In the spirit of experimentation, I actually tried 3 different solvents on this piece. So I experimented with 2 Eco House solvents, the Neutral Thin and the Extra Mild Citrus Thinner, and I also used Gamsol by Gamblin. And all 3 of these solvents are rated as being the safest solvents available, and they all worked exceptionally well with the Lightfast pencils and on the Lightfast paper. So I think any 3 of these would be a great choice, but just as a note, the Extra Mild Citrus Thinner is a little bit stronger, so if you want some more potency to your solvent, you might want to try that one out. If you are interested in trying out any of these solvents or trying out the Lightfast pencils or the Lightfast paper, I have links in the description below so you can check those out and try them out if you're interested. After the solvent has dried, I come in with colored pencil again with a second pass. And this second pass is not my final pass. I am going to come in with more detail and build up the opacity more in another layer. So I'm not worried about taking this all the way to the finish line. But what I am interested in doing is building up the values a little bit more accurately. Right here, you notice that I've built up the petal and then I'm looking at the space around and I am looking at how dark that value of the leaf behind the petal should be. Having some of the value in the background as I'm building up the flowers is going to allow me to create that nice pop and contrast that's going to make the flowers stand out from the background. As I build up the value in the background and start establishing more detail and structure to the leaves, I am not adding the same amount of detail to each and every leaf. There are some areas in this composition that are actually much further back in space. like the area that I'm working on in this top left corner. And in this area, there are some veins, there are some leaves, there are some vines, but they are not very close in comparison to the flower. And so I'm going to kind of abstract this area. I'm going to break it down into basic shapes and value, and I am going to map it in, like I said, in an abstract way, which means I'm not worried about each of these shapes looking like leaves. I'm just worried about building up an environment that makes sense with these flowers. And the environment here is a little bit more out of focus and is not going to be the main focal point. So again, I'm just going to focus on shapes. But as I move to those leaves that are closer to the viewer, I am going to add a lot more detail. Here I am developing the shadow shape. I'm making sure that that shadow shape is very accurate and precise. I'm also focusing on developing the texture of the leaf at this point. Those leaves far in the background are not going to have a very obvious texture, but a leaf that is so close to the viewer is going to have a much more obvious texture. So I am mapping it in with these small circular motions that give the leaf this speckly pattern. I don't actually show this on this particular video, but after I finish up this second layer of colored pencil, I blend it out with solvent again. And this really helps me to establish a nice opacity throughout my entire colored pencil drawing. After that solvent dries completely, and this is a minimum of 15 to 20 minutes, then I can come back with colored pencils and approach my drawing with the final details. And at this point, I'm not planning on coming back into any area with solvent, so I'm really focusing on taking each and every one of these areas to the finish line. Here I'm working on the passion flower, and I do want the most detail and the most clarity and crispness in the flower because the flower is the focal point of this composition. So I make sure to really figure out how detailed the flower is going to be before I transition and move into working on the leaves. Before I begin working on the final texture in the leaves, I really want to make sure that I have this passion flower, this focal point of my composition complete. And the reason for that is that it is creating that visual hierarchy. Once I know how much detail is going to be in the flower and that the flower is complete, I can create the leaves to support the flower. I can scale the amount of detail that is in the surrounding areas to best complement what is happening in the flower or in the focal area. When I come back and start working on the background, one of the things that I like to do first is to really anchor my darks. I've been building up the value throughout the entire process, but at this point, I really want to push my darks a little bit darker and make sure that they are accurate representations of the value that will be in my final piece. Having these darker darks in the background are going to contrast against the lighter lights in the flower petals, and it's going to create this really strong contrast that brings more attention to the flower and makes those flowers pop off the page. The local color of the leaves is green, and when you are developing dark values on a green form, you don't necessarily just grab for your darkest greens in your set. You also don't grab for black. You want to look for other colors that are going to act as complements to green. So here I have kind of a dark muted red. Red and green are complementary colors. So when I add these two together, I get a less saturated green and I actually get a darker green. Having a little bit of red in my green leaves adds more interest and variety to the green tones that I can make. If you are interested in learning a little bit more about mixing a variety of different kinds of greens, you probably want to check out this video where I just unpack all things green, how to mix green colors, how to modulate green tones. And if that is of interest to you, you can get the link to that video in the notes below. As I am laying in those last couple layers of pencil, it's important to me to get the color and also the texture of these leaves as accurate as possible. If I were to analyze the specific texture of these leaves, I notice that they are smooth yet speckly. To draw each individual speckle or to draw the texture exactly would be exhausting, but I could mark the major shapes and then use a circular mark with my pencil to approximate the texture I see in the reference. Although seeing every little detail in your references is hugely important and is a great skill for realistic artists to develop, it is just as important to be able to simplify this texture when necessary. The size of this particular artwork doesn't really invite more texture, and if I were to overdo it, then I would pull focus away from the flowers. So I simplified and approximated the texture by applying a variety of different colors in small circular marks, and I softened this texture in application as I moved further back into the background. If the speckling texture that I was creating with my colored pencils ever got a little too speckly, I could always mellow down the texture by burnishing over the top of it with a lighter colored pencil. In some areas, I did this with white, but I also grabbed light yellow pencils and light green pencils and used those, applying a ton of pressure to kind of smooth out that speckling texture. When you are working on highly detailed, realistic artwork, you're often in one small area for a long time. And sometimes this can result in you not stepping back from your work and taking a look at it holistically. So in a situation like this, where I am drawing passion flowers with a lot of leaves around them, I want to tell myself regularly to step back and see how these leaves are complementing and supporting the flowers. When I stepped back around this phase in the drawing, I noticed that I really needed to push the darks even darker in this area with the really dense vines. Pushing these darks really dark and eliminating a lot of texture in the leaves allowed this area to sink back and for the other leaves around it to pop forward. So really pushing and anchoring your darks can be a great way to really create that contrast, pop, and impact in your drawing. And this is true for botanical pieces with lots of leaves, but this is also true for any subject matter. Be really thoughtful and conscious about the value relationships and the edge relationships. And high contrast between values or between edges can be a great way to add emphasis and to enhance the focal point in your work. Throughout this video, you saw me create this drawing of the passion flowers, and you learned some strategies that you can implement in your own work to draw leaves that really make your flowers pop off the page. I'll see you next week. Bye.